Stalin did have a certain amount of charm, but Churchill knew that Stalin was a mass murderer. It was very difficult for him to have this romantic comrade-in-arms attitude towards somebody who he knew was a vicious tyrant.
But now we are at war.
Bratya is your spirit.
I love you all.
We want a better world.
Satan ist ein Symbol.
He said it was like taking a block of ice to the North Pole. And he got out of his plane and somebody described him as getting out of his plane and looking like a bull in the bull ring with the picadors prodding him. He met Stalin, and typical Stalin tactic. They were friendly to start with. The second day, Stalin was absolutely vile to him. Churchill got in a terrible temper and said he was going to leave. Stalin, of course, was bugging his dacha and knew exactly what he was saying, and then made overtures to him. And their final night, they both drank huge buckets of champagne, and Stalin devoured the head of a suckling pig with a knife, and they had a sort of rapport. Churchill was a creature of the First World War. He'd seen the troops in Flanders, what he called chewing barbed wire. And he'd always afterwards thought in terms of flank attacks. As a cavalryman, that was perfectly obvious. You find a vulnerable flank and you'd move in on that. Particularly with the defeat of Singapore, the failure of British arms almost everywhere, I think he was uneasy about taking the Germans on in a full frontal attack. To postpone the evil day of putting his own troops up against the very, very hardened divisions of Nazi Germany. His strategy was to attack what he called the soft underbelly of Europe. He tried to persuade Stalin. He drew a crocodile for Stalin and said, you don't bash him on the hard snout, you slit open his underbelly. And Stalin quite liked that analogy. Churchill was curious about Stalin. He was a romantic as well as a realist. And he liked to think of Stalin as sort of a comrade in arms. And sometimes he said, I like that man, I want to be friends with him. It's summed up to me, I think, rather nicely by something that happened on that trip, where Churchill said to Stalin that he was very fond of goldfish. Stalin was obviously completely baffled by that and suggested that Churchill should have some for breakfast. And that, I think, sums up the difference between the brutal red tyrant and the humane and civilized animal-loving Brit. It was a very odd relationship. I think Stalin did have a certain respect for Churchill, but he also played him, and played him very successfully.